Hey, Nazca friends, great to be back with you. As we promised in Annapolis, we said we would capture some of the content and commentary around communicating in a virtual world. And so this is not just for those of you who attended Annapolis, but feel free to share it with your staffs in states across the country.
Yeah, so we're gonna kind of start at start. Those of you who are in Annapolis will have seen some of this, but again, for those who are tuning in for the first time, we'll kind of go from beginning to where we land.
Yeah, so let's start with what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take a whole body of research and experiences and leadership techniques and compress it into something that's accessible and useful for you all in state government.
Yeah. So these are headlines from the past 6 months or something like this. I mean, we've been having this conversation about the Great Resignation and the future of work and what hybrid means. And I think the term new normal comes up a lot, or back to normal.
Everybody's an expert about the future of work, can say categorically what the future of work is going to be.
It is just, it's been excruciating to navigate. And I think we're all still trying to navigate that. So here's what we posit is that the new normal, whatever version of that looks like for your organization, will have an element of hybrid meetings going forward. I think that's here to stay. Easy to say, harder to do really well, despite being locked into a hybrid environment for the past 2 years. In some regards, we're still missing the mark. In others, we have learned some things, but hopefully this is just a baseline and some foundation building for how to do this well and intentionally for the folks who are in the office, around us, from a proximity standpoint, and the folks who aren't as fortunate or very fortunate not to be in the office with and around us. And if we do this well, we can continue to build cultures and drive our organizations forward in a way that we haven't historically, but could be really valuable for a lot of folks.
So the backdrop to this is whatever the format of remote in office each state has, we expect that there will be a virtual and hybrid component to everything that everybody's doing. Okay, so we should start with the fundamentals. Even though we are talking on virtual and hybrid platforms, the fundamentals of communication don't change. There are 3 aspects to any piece of communication. We often forget the third. We want people to know something. We want to transfer information. We want people to do something as a result of that transfer. And then the bit we all forget often because we're so busy is, how do we want people to feel? And those rules apply. And if we focus on all 3, we can tend to influence and get our communication across in a smart way.
Yeah. So knowing the technology, sure. Knowing the information we're passing through the technology, awesome. Doing something with that, using tech better, or the information we passed along. But as we're navigating what we know and what we expect folks to do, how we feel on the way is important. One of the ways to get there, one of the ways to really dial in how somebody feels as we communicate with them, is this concept we call SNR, or signal to noise ratio. And this came from when we were laying cable across the Atlantic.
From the engineers.
Did you send it to us, or did we send it your way?
I don't know, but it was between the United Kingdom and the United States.
Of course it was.
First underwater telegram cables by probably the Marconi company.
Yeah. And so these massive cables, the signal, the amount of information that is comprehensible when it gets to us, might be a good way to think about that. The signal that goes through those cables versus the noise, the static around that, and how we balance or really optimize for signal instead of noise works from laying cables across the Atlantic in the same way it does when we communicate. So there are so many pieces that go into communicating well, but the job is for me to be using words that resonate with you as an audience. And the more words I use that connect to you, resonate with you, versus words that seem superfluous or aren't important to you, is really the ratio we're trying to dial in. Can I get as close to 1-to-1 every single word I say is resonating with, important, and landing with my audience? That signal to noise ratio, highly critical.
So the first job before you get to any tech at all is to be thinking about your audience and what's important to them. And almost instinctively, because you're a sentient human being, you'll start thinking about tone of voice, how you're physically positioned, the format in which you should communicate, and start to think of the platforms, the Teams and the WebExes and the Zooms and the Google Meets as simply the broadcast signal. That's all it is. It's just the channel, it's the cable through which you're presenting. And all of the content, you are the HBO or the Showtime or CBS News. That's you. And that's really the focus on it.
Yeah.
Do you know, I was thinking there's a scene in that Churchill movie, one of the recent ones, where he's calling Franklin Roosevelt over a very staticky line. If we had the rights to it, we could illustrate the signal to noise ratio. Yeah. But I'd have to do my Winston Churchill impression. You'd have to do Franklin Roosevelt. We'll skip that.
I was going to go with Churchill, but yeah, fine.
Actually,
fair enough.
That would be better.
So the job is to step back from what we think and who we think we are. It's to disenthrall ourselves from ourselves, because this is about the audience. This is about you at home, as Scott and I are in the studio having a good time, or at least pretending to do so. It's not about us. It is about all of you folks tuned in for, you know, the folks who have self-selected into watching this webinar, because communicating in a hybrid environment is important. Our job is to make sure you get the things you need. And fortunately, we've done our homework and you've shared a fair amount of that with us. And so this is kind of the report out, but it's not about us, it's about you. And we ought to orient to virtual or hybrid environments very similarly, with the audience in mind first.
This is how we get very macro. We're doing the things that we're teaching. So our know, do, and feel is we want you to know some techniques to be more influential over virtual platforms. And do is we want you to try them. How we want you to feel is this is actually very doable. Like, it's not as complicated as people make out. But what we have to do is we have to focus on the audience and not ourselves. I got the audience right now.
So understanding motive, back to how we disenthrall ourselves from ourselves and focus on the audience. Understanding motive, really important. So at the bottom of the pyramid, this looks like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those familiar, at the bottom of the pyramid is survival motive, the thing we will act irrationally to protect. Scott, what is that for you?
It's my children and their education, and the roof over their heads. And if my income level or my sense of security gets close to putting them in any risk at all, the quality of life, I start to do really crazy irrational things to make sure they're provided for. So when you're speaking to an audience, you want to try to gauge, is anybody in your audience in a place where they're just emotionally not as stable as they might be, and be aware of that and speak to that. If everybody's doing generally okay, they're not sort of brushing against their survival need. And that would include things like people going through marital challenges, or like just things that you're having your senses up to be aware that people might be in a really rough place, in which case you're going to have to communicate in a very different way, which again, you instinctively know.
I think a personal example for me, my partner has acute anxiety, and that is really, really hard, particularly over the past 2 years, particularly because that anxiety is rooted in health and kind of medicine. And so coming off of a pandemic where she's been kind of separated from friends and family for a long time and in a tough place, how one might communicate there, we have to take survival motive into account. If we miss that, we miss how someone might be receptive, what that signal to noise ratio actually is, and how we ought to be checking in and communicating.
You know, what I'm realizing there is when you describe having your partner, Julie, that comes as a shock to a lot of people who've seen us on media and just presumed we're a couple. But no, Ace does have a significant other. It's not me, it's Julie. She's terrific. So yeah, once you're above that sort of that core need, then you're focusing on your audience's identity motive. You go right to the top of that hierarchy. And this is sort of people's idea of themselves. It is not how people actually are. It's how do people see themselves. So with if you're dealing with cabinet members in government, in state government, you know, it takes a degree of sense of self to take that appointment, if it's a political position, to be approved by whichever legislative body. And you're trying to speak in a way that resonates with that. On the other hand, if you are dealing with a group of people who identify themselves as protectors, it might be the audit department, right, or the risk management team. You're thinking through that lens and speaking in a language that resonates with that. We could speak forever on this, and actually, if you sign up for the NASCA Transformative Leadership Development Program, we will go really deep into how you communicate on a level with individuals based upon how they come. But there is a sort of, just by going through these steps and thinking about it, you will naturally find a cadence and a tone to speak with people by thinking about what their situation is.
Yeah. What's next?
Oh, yeah. Just as we're sort of thinking about conversations, we tend to categorize as we think about remote employees that these experiences are the same. And just keep in mind that one person's work from home can be very different from another person's work from home. And that can range from having a really super at-home office with a great Wi-Fi connection through to really abusive, unhealthy home environments where people might be struggling, and just keeping that in mind as we work through.
Absolutely. I mentioned pandemic as we think about other health implications across the world right now. Loneliness is a big one. You've got some stats around men particularly.
I can speak for the United Kingdom, and the United States is catching up very quickly. It's very sad to say that the number 2 killer of men in the United Kingdom is not heart disease. It is men taking their own lives, and it's deeply tied to this sense of loneliness and lack of belonging. And these numbers in the United States are rocketing as well. And I think this is essentially just a call out to keep in mind, especially for those of you who are running remote teams. There is a chance that these all hands meetings or these team meetings that are happening virtually is sort of one of those few chances that people get to connect. So create space in your agenda for that to happen, and give people a sense of belonging. There's a raft of articles out there at the moment. This was a headline just from a week ago. Magazine articles. You don't have to go too deep into it, but do be aware of the sense of social isolation that people are having that was on a trend pattern before the pandemic, but has obviously been exacerbated since the pandemic. So treat these moments where we're connecting digitally as really significant touch points for your team.
So stagecraft, this is our world. It's an art, really. Stagecraft, you kind of hear this in a James Bond movie, if you will, or in the theater. The mechanics of creating an environment by which to communicate and exist to influence optimal outcomes. Stagecraft works in the room, the way that we position ourselves, how and where we project, who we talk to, the eye contact. This works in the virtual world in the same way. We can design and prime and frame an environment to be conducive to accomplishing outcomes as we would in person, the same way.
So let's give some examples of this. We could deliver this webinar from our beds at home, and functionally we could deliver the same information. We could absolutely deliver the same information. The technology allows us to do that. But the visible existence of a microphone here, whether it's plugged in or not, says that we're taking this seriously. Having a backdrop that's a formal backdrop shows that we're taking it seriously. Even the presence of the iPads and the computers on the table are indicating a sense of tone and seriousness about it. At the same time, the fact that we're both drinking cups of tea brings a sense of informality to it. And so this is the world of stagecraft. We are priming people to respond in certain ways. Priming is a psychological phrase. That a prime is a stimuli that affects your response to a second stimuli. And this is where we get into some of the techniques. But before we go there, should we just show that this is a very temporary backdrop? Like if we can physically pick this thing up and walk away and move it, and you'll see a whole bunch of props and things behind that as it goes. So we are literally, it's very much like theater. It's not going to fall down mid conversation.
Everybody's just seen my safari shorts.
Out of interest,
now.
I mean, some of these things are not expensive. So if you're thinking about sort of procurement departments, I'm looking at Vera, one of our producers, the producer, Nazca producer, and I think these things run at like maybe $1,000 for the frame and the banner as it runs through. So depending upon what you're doing, it can be important or not. So we talked about this, that the technology is simply the broadcast stream. Pre-show, psychological priming I touched on. So this idea that we will respond to the second stimuli. The second stimuli is you presenting. The first stimuli is what happens as people are waiting for the meeting to happen. This is where your playlist kicks in.
Oh, I've got a playlist that I very much love. It's I called it adult contemporary the other day, and somebody yelled at me for that. No, it's got a little bit of everything from Cameo to Fleetwood to Lake Street Dive, and we use it for conferences when we're here in the studio hosting folks from around the globe who will fly in and we'll put on an event in person. We put the playlist on as they're getting to the studio. The second piece, though, is we put the playlist on as folks are logging in to the call itself. And so as we're producing a webinar or a podcast or what have you, an event virtually, using music as a way to frame the energy, prime the engagement in an event is critical, and it works. It works. When there's music on, you start seeing chatter in the chat that says, oh my God, this is so much fun. I love this jam. I'm just hanging out, drinking my coffee. Like, people will start to engage in a way that you might not have seen had you not thought about kind of putting some pieces in place to give them a reason to engage. It's really important.
Now, if a NASCA member emailed you and asked you for the playlist, you can share that?
I can share that.
Yeah. Our emails will be at the end of this webinar, and feel free to drop him a note for his playlist.
Absolutely.
So we talked about isolation and the sense of connection. We really recommend for any virtual meeting that you open up with a feeling check-in. It can be as simple as, you know, running an online poll. We use Slido, but there's a raft of online software out there. You can use chat in whichever software that you're using, which is just like, hey, everybody, how was your weekend? Or did anybody have a great breakfast this morning? How caffeinated are people? Just anything that allows people to open up and gets people to engage haptically. Haptic is related to the sensorial sensation of tapping on a keyboard, that they're in, that they're part of this, that they're included in this group.
Yeah, and I'll pause on that for a second, because there's nuance and difference between an icebreaker and a check-in, right? Yeah. You know, the icebreaker is, tell me somewhere you'd like to travel in the next, and that feels like forced family fun. And that's not exactly where we want to land. I mean, we've done a lot of that, particularly as we're trying to do team building and all of that stuff virtually. The icebreaker is not quite where we're heading. On this one, it's just hey, how are you doing? Sound off in the chat. Just want to check in, make sure everybody's in a good place. If you're not in a great place, PM me and maybe excuse yourself from the meeting, or we'll get through this quickly so you can get back to whatever fire you're putting out or crisis you're dealing with. Whatever that is, just a vibe check is a term I've used.
A vibe check.
Vibe check. Just check in with folks, not icebreaker to get folks engaged. It's a little different, but important to kind of note that.
Have you trademarked the vibe check?
I have not trademarked vibe check. It is a hashtag, I'm sure, though. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Making sure voices are heard, and ensuring that this is particularly important for smaller meetings, you know, meetings of 6 to 12 people. Just as we have in person, there's a tendency for some people to dominate a conversation over others. And while you're in the room together, you will physically see people not getting a voice, and you tend to be more aware of it. Digitally, it's harder to do that. So the technique that we encourage is, anytime we're in a meeting like this, we will take a notepad and we draw a rectangle as if it's a table, and we write the names of the participants next to it. And every time somebody speaks during a meeting, we just put a check mark next to their name. And it helps you identify, you know, the number of times somebody's contributing, and most importantly, if somebody isn't contributing to the conversation.
So if they're not contributing, what do you do? Is that like a real time, hey, you haven't said anything?
Let's be clear what we don't do. We don't do that.
Okay, don't do that.
Hey, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah.
No, we don't do that. We do the opposite of that. We don't make any reference to it at all. But after the meeting, we make a phone call, and I'd encourage a phone call. I guess you could send an instant message, but I prefer a phone call. So if you were part of that meeting, you hadn't contributed something, I'd give you a call following the meeting, just be, hey, Ace, I noticed that you're fairly quiet in the meeting. I just wanted to make sure, you know, are you good with everything, or were you a little quieter because you're worried about some things? Yeah. And look, best case scenario, or most valuable, is that Ace says, actually, I'm really concerned about this project, but I feel my voice isn't heard and you get to hear. You know, but at worst, you say, hey, no, I was just good with everything.
Yeah.
But you walk away with a feeling that the host of that meeting really cared, right? Gave a darn about your thoughts. So we really encourage that. Just keep an eye on the voices being heard.
Absolutely.
So as part of that, most of these meeting softwares have the spotlight function.
Yeah. And it's a great function, right? If you think about a newscaster or in a control room running a broadcast, as you go from in-field anchor to anchor kind of in studio versus in-field, how we bounce between those two presenters is important. We can create or recreate the same function in Zoom, and using the spotlight feature, Zoom, webinar, WebEx, Meet, etc. Using that spotlight feature allows us to put attention on a speaker. So when somebody has the floor, instead of handing them the speaking stick, right, we can simply spotlight them. Similarly, if somebody is hogging the floor, if somebody's running too long, if somebody's going off on a tangent, it's really easy to highlight the host or highlight the next person you want to hear from and say, hey, thanks, Jim. We're going to pop to, Pam to make sure that we hear how she's feeling about the thing that you were just speaking to. This happens in a hybrid world as well. And it's really important to note this. The spotlight feature, we don't think about that in the room. We don't consider that physically we spotlight folks. Scott, what would you like to say on that topic, right? We hand the spotlight
over
is sort
of
to
the
folks.
Spotlight. It is. It's the open palm where Vera, would you have something to say?
And so if two people speak at the same time, we actually very quickly as humans resolve that. No, you go ahead. What we've done is instead of me having the spotlight, you take it, because we tried to start making a point at the same time. What doesn't happen, or what is really hard, and we have to be intentional about, is the kind of difference between in-person and virtual. If we're hybrid, one of the protocols we use is if two people start to speak at the same time, one's in the room, one has dialed in and is virtual, always spotlight the virtual person. Always default to the person who's virtual. They're missing a lot of the rich interaction just based on proximity, based on being in the room, the body language, etc. Give them the opportunity to speak first. If you ever have kind of a tie runner, make sure that person who is virtual gets the opportunity to go first, and then bring in the person who's in person.
If it's a tie runner, go for the remote first.
There we go. I like that.
Okay. Defining the meeting. So let's lift some load on your participants, but being very clear whether a meeting is sort of a run-of-the-mill briefing type meeting or whether it's really critical. If it's a run-of-the-mill type briefing meeting, you get to encourage people, if they're working from home, if everybody's remote, sure, fold your laundry while you're participating in this. On the other hand, and also encourage cameras off. We'll come on to that in a second. Like, hey, this is just essentially a conference call with slides. On the other hand, if this is really critical, make clear that it is, and you want people focused and not doing anything else and really engaging in the debate. And then the purpose of it: are we decision making? Are we updating? Are we ideating? And craft an agenda that sort of follows that. The camera thing is a major issue. Recent surveys are showing that there's a significant number of the business population, the employee population, that is just really struggling with cameras on as the default. So just be purposeful and clear about why you're making that request and how important it is. I would say it is oftentimes more thoughtful for people to hear and focus on listening than on watching. And I'm conscious that we made the choice that we'd run slides throughout this. That's partly because we feel this is a podcast with visual aids rather than having to see our beautiful visages.
But that goes back to signal to noise ratio, right? Like being intentional about what information we want folks to have, how is most conducive to getting it to them. I find that I can, quite frankly, listen better when I hop on a phone call or Zoom without video on, because we're no longer, and again, humans have this tendency to do this, looking at ourselves on the screen. So I'm pointing above what looks like camera to you, because our screen is behind the camera. And so looking to make sure we look good, and I don't have my, resting face on, and people think I'm engaged, and all of those things takes energy. And if we could devote that energy just to being on the phone, listening and making sure we got the information, that's important. So there's a time and a place is the point. Knowing what and how that looks, I think, is important as well.
Yeah. For those of you working with employees that are in more rural locations that might not have the same bandwidth that a dense urban location that has, turning cameras off allows the pipes to focus on voice. And voice is intonation of voice is so much more important than the visual. Linked with that, switching cameras off and working on a piece of software with audio can also be very powerful. So if it's an ideation session, using one of the many common and oftentimes free pieces of software out there to solve a problem together. And it's also okay to say, hey, we're on a call, but for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to play Ace's playlist and we're all going to write ideas on X, Y, and Z. You're very passionate about using different forms of ideation for problem solving rather than the classic brainstorm.
The classic brainstorm. Yeah. I mean, brainstorm's one technique, but there are myriad other techniques, and being thoughtful about which one we use and how we use that particularly in a virtual realm where you mentioned voices aren't always heard equally, being able to, I'll use the term democratize how we ideate, how we collaborate, how we work together. The technology that exists today that didn't years ago, I think puts us in a really good place to be intentional about the tool we use, how we bring people together, and then giving them space to collaborate virtually.
And now, Ace, this message is on behalf of the Executive Director of NASCA, Pam Goins. Quick question. Will you be diving deeply into ideation techniques during the Transformational Leadership Development Program brought to you by NASCA?
Yes, I will. Yes, I will, Scott. That's an excellent question.
So,
transparency.
Staying on transparency, this message was brought to you by staying around this idea of sort of purpose of the meeting. And just you touched on this, like thinking of the remote, if there's an underclass in a meeting and it's hybrid, then it's very much virtual. But the sense of being left out is greater virtually because you are not physically in the room. We even use that language, oh, I was in the room when it happened. I think there was a musical that had it. Some revolutionary musical that happened. We brushed that over. So being transparent about how decisions are being made. Not giving everybody voice all the time, but just being like, hey, I want to hear ideas and then I'm going to make decisions is kind of very important, how decisions are being made.
Actually, well, I think because you've got a really good point about the proximity and transparency around not being in the room and understanding that decisions are made appropriately. You've got a point about when the boss leaves from a webinar as well, from a virtual kind of broadcast, because this leads to the transparency and feeling like you've got the up and up happening.
So at the end of a meeting, whoever is the most senior person, the person that sort of seems to have the power to delegate opportunities and promotions, those sorts of things, we always encourage that person, if it's an entirely virtual meeting, to as soon as the meeting ends, get out of there. No small talk at the end, so people know that they're not missing out on anything. If it's hybrid, even more important is to leave the physical environment if you're in person, so that those remote are not watching people essentially career network, or have the impression that they're career networking and missing out as we go to the hybrid. The one right of appeal technique, this is a technique we encourage, which is to try to avoid the digital back channeling. If you're a leader, there's a chance with all of these Slack channels and instant messaging, texting on private message, that while you're discussing something, there's a lot of back channeling and dissent going on. You can't control for that. But if you introduce this methodology, you're likely to reduce it, which is simply to culturally introduce this idea that when you make decisions, you are open to people appealing those decisions, but they do it directly. They come to you and they ask for their one right of appeal, where if Ace is my boss, I get to come and say, Ace, I saw you make decision X. I'd like to invoke my one right of appeal. Ace's commitment is that he'll schedule 15 minutes for me to make the case. My commitment is Ace will relook at that decision. But once he's made that decision, either holding the ground that he originally said or changing it, I back it to the hilt. I don't back channel it. You're trying to channel that. And if you have questions about that, we can go deeper into that on another session at some time.
So scheduling, really critical as well. Okay, we're more distributed, and granted, as we're talking to CAOs and staff, kind of constrained to your state at least, which makes time zones less of an issue, but the realities of life for a lot of folks, it's school runs and being on custody schedules. I know those are real things that we deal with. Time zones, for those of you fortunate to have split states with different time zones, religious holidays across the spectrum of religions, all of those pieces mean being really intentional about when I can get the right people in the room, virtually, in person, or a blend of the two, centered around their life requirements. Just being thoughtful about what that looks like, how we schedule, where meetings land, either in time of day or time of month around holidays and time out, etc. We're recalibrating to the flex schedules that I think are really conducive to getting work done for some people. But we need to kind of recalibrate around that tiny bit.
Scheduling's a different world.
It is. It is.
Okay. On that note, time efficiency. Agenda, always. And we've got a link to a template here that we recommend, which you'll notice has the meeting purpose, the role in the meeting, how decisions are going to be made. You can sort of look at this yourselves, but whatever format that you have, many meetings now we see without an agenda. Please don't run meetings that way. Take the chance to frame and scope and direct the behaviors as you have them.
And then switching modality, right? Every 20 minutes or so for a meeting, particularly for kind of the virtual conferences, just switching the tempo of how we operate, how we're communicating, and, you know, slotting in a video. Even if it's a video of you saying the thing you would have said live, putting a video on just switches how folks are orienting to and paying attention, engaging with content. And so, you know, for us, that was getting up when we moved to the backdrop. It's switching from topic to topic. It's the banter in between. All of those things are small modality shifts that reorient you to the content being presented. The same will happen as you're presenting out to audiences, rather than being locked into lecture mode or just listening as it feels like someone's droning on. The job is to keep people interested and engaged, and 20 minutes is about the time limit.
You just switch it. It can even be a video about, hey, here's the latest update to our expenses policy. It's just anything that changes format. We're coming to you from our studios. Here's a behind the scene look at what a mess this place is. But switching from, you know, one person presenting to two people discussing, these things sort of matter, and they hold people's attention as they run through. Just think about it as you go. And commercial breaks, as I mentioned, it can be a commercial break for another agency. It can be an initiative. It can be a video clip of a governor's press conference. Just something that changes.
And right now. So that is an example of a commercial break, and it again switches modality, gets you re-energized, reoriented to content, and then we come back in, and it doesn't have to be as tongue-in-cheek, on the nose as a TLDP commercial break, although just so you know, TLDP is worth checking in on. No, it doesn't have to be a commercial break, but think of it as a break in content to give people some time to stretch their legs, go do a thing, and then come back and plug back in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, a little bit on the technical front. This is something that's called a switcher. You can buy these things for about $250. If you really want to make yourself or your team look great, invest in one of these. They're very simple to learn how to use, but essentially they will allow you to do things like transition slides and have more than one camera running through the same stream. We won't spend a lot of time here. We can go deeper on a future webinar if people show interest in it. Just drop us a note. Emails are at the end of this presentation, and we can run another NASCAR session on a deep dive in some of the technical stuff.
Yeah. Prizes. So we use these a lot. You'll see as we're in person doing things, if we have stickers or cards or some tactile, tangible giveaways. But as Scott likes to say, Americans love free things. Buffets and free things, I think is what Scott would actually say, but free things. So during a long engagement, during a virtual webinar, etc., being able to say, hey, and if you're logged in at the end, or hey, we're going to take a little quick break and I've got a bag of chocolates. You bring chocolates back.
So this was a photograph I took from my hotel bed when I last came back from the UK, smuggling British chocolate back to the US. And we give this away and we give all kinds of things away, but the best idea, the worst idea, the most interesting contribution, just try to keep it real. And we'll come on to physical mail stuff in a little while. Now we've touched on hybrid a little bit in earlier comments, but we should dive more deeply into this. In hybrid meetings, where you have some people in the room and some people remote, proximity bias is a phrase you're going to see come up again and again and again over the next few months. It's this idea that the closer to the center of power that an individual is, the more advantages that they get. It is not a new thing. If you've ever worked at a satellite location versus headquarters, you'll have felt this or seen people talking about it, but it's going to become increasingly acute. It's very, very important as we think about hybrid meetings to be aware of proximity bias or the sense of it, whether it's real or not, between those in the room and those who are virtual. So here are some rules. If you're having a hybrid meeting, you're streaming a meeting that's happening in person.
Yep. Everybody uses online chat for questions, commentary. Of course, you'll have audio and video, and so having a discussion in the room makes sense. But in order to make sure everybody is up to speed on what's happening, particularly those not in the room, making sure that questions are reiterated or comments are reiterated in the chat so they can see it in real time, even if their audio goes out, they miss the video and who was speaking, they can see all of that kind of as an artifact.
This is way harder than it seems, because if Ace is typing his question, but I'm in the room and I'm saying, yeah, but boss, we're here. Anyway, can I say what that is doing is giving primacy to the people that's in the room. We are reinforcing that proximity bias. You have to be very firm. Like, nope, all questions in the chat so everybody can see them as they come through and we work through. It's much tougher than it seems. Likewise, only online slides, no projector in the room with the original slides. Have a screen that is streaming the call. It means that everybody is experiencing that same slight delay that you're seeing even on this webinar of the slides that are coming through. So everybody is experiencing the same thing at the same time.
Yeah, so moderator is a really valuable tool to use here, and we'd suggest often that this not be the person in charge. Whoever's top of the food chain, top of the hierarchy, let's not make them the moderator. And what that allows someone to do is watch the commentary coming through via chat and being able to pull the questions based on relevance or based on timeliness into the conversation as appropriate, similarly giving voice to those not in the room and marrying or kind of weaving that into those in the room.
It also allows, if you are the boss, it allows you to speak more fluidly and more freely. If Ace is the boss and he's having to be the fair moderator, it doesn't allow him to forcefully express his opinions. Whereas if he delegates that moderation to me, I can say, hey, Ace, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? And he doesn't have to appear neutral, impartial, fair.
It also levels the playing field. If a moderator says to the boss, hey, actually, we're going to go here first, it gives everyone that sense of buy-in and kind of equal footing as we're making decisions.
Which goes to polling. And rather than asking for a show of hands in the room, online polling, it gives everybody an equal voice, but it also gives that sense of participation. Depending upon what your software and security guidelines are, software that allows people to engage on their phones while watching on a screen, we are big fans of it. Again, it gives that tactile interaction. You're essentially using your phone as a remote. We can go deeper into this. If people have questions, we can do another quick recording on polling software and interaction and those types of things.
Yeah, so audio, if you have to choose one thing to get really crisp, I would say audio is your best friend here. Audio, the perception of good audio gives the perception of seriousness, of having a tight ship, of doing real work. And so for those who can't be on video because of bandwidth, audio is the thing that gives them the best signal and gets you closer to that signal to noise ratio. A good microphone is your best investment. A decent camera is a worthwhile kind of balance to the best microphone you can afford. And there are some plenty solid ones on the market that plug directly into whatever system you already have existing.
The biggest technical slip up here is the feedback loop that's created if you have speakers in the room. So if it's a large in-person meeting, let's say it's 50 people and you need to use the AV system in the meeting room, in the conference center, but you're also having the microphone work for a virtual aspect of the hybrid meeting, that's where you start hearing these painful feedback loops that are agonizing to the eardrums. It is important that you work with somebody that understands audio visual, whether it's the venue location or somebody on your staff, to make sure that you're not hearing that. If people are hearing squawks and repetition, you really do lose your audience very, very quickly. So this is a configuration of a studio that we set up. Actually, in this case, the client was recognized how serious this was and had us fly to London to set up this configuration. You notice that there are cameras at the back, but the cameras take a central position. So it's not that this was a panel discussion. It's not so that the web version is this side view. Actually, we're treating it like television. You get the full-on view. And you can't quite see this, but there's a separate microphone system for in the room and for the cameras, but they're synchronized so that you're not getting those feedback loops as it goes. Notice the moderator stand that is there for people, for the moderator to ask questions of the group. And in this case, we had people handling the cameras so that we're zooming in on the individuals to ensure that that experience for people who were remote was as good as possible.
Yeah, and this is kind of the culmination of all of the things, of some of the stagecraft, the placement, the setting, having solid operators. So training one's team up, and that was part of what we did, was not only set up this kind of town hall configuration, but trained the staff on how to use that, and then kind of shadowed them through one of those events. And lastly, the microphone that might be laving someone to go to the kind of webcast, but having a handheld mic in the room, whatever that configuration is, there are a lot of ways to get to the right outcome. But again, being intentional about the folks at home as much as, if not more so, the folks in the room.
We talked about this earlier, but you can imagine that room if you're on remote, and as the meeting wraps up, what you see is your counterparts and your peers all going, shaking the hands of the boss, talking about the future career prospects. There we have that proximity bias rearing its head again. So really do try to coach the leader in the room that they need to exit pretty promptly when it all wraps up to avoid the impression of bias. Along those lines,
keep the boss moving. So sometimes in the room, right? Sometimes in the room, because that's how we're starting to reorient, is back to the office for a lot of organizations, but have the boss dial in, right? Virtually from their home office, have that be solo from their office, having a meeting of folks who might be in the building together, but making sure the folks at home are as supported as the folks in person. This is a good way to do that.
Yeah, so if let's choose a large state. If you're based in Sacramento, California, you're hosting the meeting from there, make sure that every other meeting, the boss is not in Sacramento. It could be a field office in San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Fresno, or it could be that they're at home dialing in like another one of your remote workers. So don't try to de-emphasize headquarters, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, asynchronous, let's not dismiss this. We don't all have to be live all the time. And we've got some techniques for you here. Most of your smartphones will have a voice memo easily on it. That allows
use them often.
Yeah,
they're great. They're great.
It's the contemporary dictaphone. Don't underestimate these. It allows you to record a detailed voice message, just talk into your phone, and then email it to the team and the colleagues. So many of those meetings that you would define as briefings that we talked about earlier, do they really need to be a live synchronous meeting, or could it be a pre-recorded voice recording? Your own little podcast, your private podcast, where you brief and send it through.
And for the flex work we talked about, folks can listen to this as they're on their morning jog or their commute as they're coming into the office. Like, so many things we can get, and the voice memo here is rich, full of context and nuance as we're trying to convey something important. A written memo, similarly, we can go deep into detail, and folks can sit with that and kind of analyze the information that has been given.
Old school is back. The written memo with analysis and recommendations. Chat, so Slack, Wicker, Yammer, all these kind of software platforms. Ephemeral commentary. This is like the water cooler, chatting in the kitchen. Try not to make this deep discussion, and certainly not tasking. So if you're using it for ideas,
our chat deletes every 30 days.
It does, self-erases.
Yeah, 1 day for different rooms, 10 days for others. But I think the longest chat that we keep in our internal system is 30 days. And so that says if it needs to be something, an artifact that we need to hold on to, we put it elsewhere, which brings us to project management tools. If you're tasking, if you've got deliverables and deadlines, and are holding folks accountable to those things, which we'd imagine everyone is, project management tools where that lives. And of course, it seems like table stakes, but just understanding the right medium for the right message is really what we're driving at here.
All right, team building, photo pages. If your internet allows for this, or internal system, you know, people just posting photographs. It doesn't have to be in real time, but their pet dog, their pet animal, their favorite hobby location. Using the phone, you know, that thing where we talk to each other? Hello, or hello, however we do this. And making sure that we are using videos and memos for critical meetings to document it. For those people who can't be there, again, the way that the working schedule is changing, is capturing things that people not be able to attend in a primary version. And for critical meetings that are intense, especially if you're giving negative feedback, doing that by video with cameras on, and of course, documenting it if it's something that needs to be documented in a memo. But if we're celebrating,
emails, letters. I was actually just thinking back to a conversation we had with Ellington. I know he and Nelson and Jack and the whole crew in Maryland use the kind of letter format for praise. I know there are a couple other states who have mentioned doing the same. So folks are doing this already, but a really good way to reinforce positive feedback and kind of give somebody something tangible and tactile, particularly because we haven't been in the same place for a while.
If you're giving positive feedback and it's in a more permanent form, people can read it, reflect on it, read it again.
Yeah,
good stuff. You never received that from me, and I've never received that from you. But
no,
we should work on that.
I was going to say that is probably the expectation.
Finally, your not so secret weapon is sitting in the lobby of your apartments or your front driveway. It is the United States Postal Service, those little white vans and trucks that pull up.
I love it.
Keeping the mail men and women busy. Don't underestimate it. That letter, we talked about letter, putting something in the mail. If it is appropriate for you to have the address of your team or your employees, sending those prizes, sending a note, sending something that is tactile. We can't encourage that enough. But maybe
for all of the technology, the bells, the whistles, the machines, we're talking about the thing that shines through best. And we know this, right? We deal with and serve humans regularly. It is our job to be human. And so when the inevitability of tech kind of going on the fritz is real and we're confronted with that, lean into it. We're all dealing with the same thing and we know this, but we own that often. Hey, my volume's out. I can't hear you. My audio's out, probably operator error. And, I expected I'd talk to somebody on mute at least once today, right? Whatever that commentary is, leaning into the fact that we're all trying to figure it out, even still after 2 years and beyond, as we continue to exist in this hybrid environment, own the fact that something will go awry and we're humans.
So follow-ups, you have any questions, you have any comments, drop one of us a note. There are such things as stupid questions, but they're really welcome. We ask them all the time. We do, for those of you who are interested, we have a list of recommended equipment that we use in our studio if you want to take this seriously. If you want to deep dive on any of the subjects that we'll talked
probably
about,
cover it in the TLDP.
Oh, but why would we miss a plug for the Transformative Leadership Development Program brought to you by NASCA? Details available at nasca.org.
/TLDP.
Oh, it is.
It is. There's a URL for that. Anyway, we are not hard to find. Reach out if you've had any questions on any of the above. In all seriousness, always happy to answer that. And V's looking at us, which means she is happy to answer those questions as well. Here from the studio where are we? We're in London today.
I think we're in London.
We're in London today, according to the Brit. We will talk to all of you soon.
Cool. So we are here in Annapolis. We just wrapped up the kickoff, the announcement of the Transformational Leadership Development Program that NASCA has partnered to pull content in for CAOs, for deputies, for kind of staff. Talk to me about kind of the framework or the outcome of the program. What is this supposed to drive or do for CAOs and their people?
Well, we are so excited about this program, Ace, and so excited that the partnership is set. We're moving forward. July is, it's right around the corner. And so we're going to be together to bring state chiefs, state deputy directors, agency heads, rising leaders, right? Your stars that you know are coming up through leadership development. Bring them together in the same room so that we can have a conversation. Gosh, we got a lot of stuff: negotiation, how you're a good leader, building good steel,
partnership building. So it's really, as we think about what it means to be a good leader, frameworks, workshops, tools, some tips, some tricks.
Well, and the cool thing too is that we're doing it from the state government perspective.
Exactly.
So this isn't just another leadership development program.
This is designed around NASCA, its membership, and the things that they've shared.
Yeah, well, and state government's very different from private sector, from other industry. Like, state government works differently. And so these sessions are going to be very much tailored to how you're an effective transformational leader in that setting. So very, very much geared towards operational components and that transformational change.
Yeah, we talk a lot about listening. We listened, we heard, we designed a program around the needs of the states and the chiefs and their staff
Right.
out there across the country. So give me the particulars.
Yeah.
We've got a couple locations, I think Denver, Savannah, Tampa. Am I making that up?
You are not making that up.
Okay.
You're right on target. But you know what? Again, the fun thing is it's
Yep.
not just an in-person thing.
Okay.
It's a 10-month cohort program.
Yeah.
So they're together start to finish from July of 2022 all the way through, hopefully,
2023.
May of 2023
Yeah.
if they're able to join us. But we're going to be in person in Denver,
Okay.
July 11th and 12th.
July 11th
First
and 12th.
session, and
Great.
then they're going to come together as their cohort group with digital content.
Wait, I get to hang out in Denver, right?
You get to be with
I'm
us.
there. I think I'm facilitating a session.
I think you are.
As
So we get to
Pam
listen
told
to
me,
you.
We will get to hang out in Denver.
That's right.
And then we got Savannah.
No better place.
Right.
Savannah, March of 2023.
Okay.
And then they're going to all come together and do a NASCA national webinar to showcase the work that they've done in their state. So we're going to give
Incredible.
some reflection opportunities,
Yeah.
some opportunities for them to culminate some projects with
Yep.
their own teams, like apply their learning, right? This is
Yep.
important. And then in Tampa next year, when we're repeating this conference that we're doing here in Annapolis, we're going to have a big recognition ceremony, celebration, and then present their certification to them.
Okay, so if I wanted more information, how would I find it? Where would I find it?
It's easy.
Okay.
www.nasca.org. At the top of our website, you can pick our events, and TLDP will just jump right out at you.
Okay, so NASCA.org, from the top nav, TLDP,
Yeah.
you'll get to it. So you folks heard it here first, or rather, us in the room heard it here first. You're hearing it here second as you're tuned in live
Yeah,
from Annapolis.
from Annapolis.
With Pam and I. We will see you. Check out the TLDP. We are so excited to bring you some program, some content, and some frameworks for you and your team to continue being incredible leaders.
We'll see you in July.
Thank you.